So we're going to move on, despite the fact that my friends are desperately out there looking for coffee, I assume. We'll fill them in later. So how do you meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards? There's 5 pieces of the law, all aimed at meeting it, and they overlap. The 2 basic types of polluters are mobile or non-point source and point source. So, you know, a smokestack, I can see the one out there from Göteborg Energy, right? That's a point source. Your car is a non-point source. Your train is a non-point source, and so on and so forth. In addition to the 2 different types of sources, you have 2 different potential major jurisdictions. So point sources are all fixed in space, so they're in one state and not in another. Now, nobody foresaw that the one on the eastern edge of Ohio was going to pollute mostly, no, is it the western edge of Indiana was going to pollute mostly Ohio. No, I got it backwards. I had it right the first time. Eastern edge of Ohio is going to pollute Indiana, not Ohio. And so you can guess where the power plants are, right? You always build the power plant on your state boundary. But it was thought that it was within your state, you're the one who has to regulate that. So all point sources basically get given to states as the primary regulator. Then all mobile things, with a huge exception, were supposed to be federal because they could move back and forth between the states. And so what sense would it make to have, you know, a New Jersey regulation and a New York regulation? It wouldn't make any sense. That was the thinking. And the more something is tied to interstate commerce, the more federal you would think of it. So, you know, a railroad train that goes from Chicago to San Francisco, that's going to be something the feds are going to regulate because it's all about interstate commerce. Cars. Well, California was regulating cars before the Clean Air Act. It's true they're mobile sources, but you don't really drive them over the boundary every day in the West. So there could be some leeway. Maybe those will be state, maybe those will be federal. That's the kind of thinking that went into who got the primary jurisdiction on something. So fixed sources are definitely going to be regulated by the states, and that's what I'll describe in a moment. And then there are a whole bunch of things that are mixed, including fixed sources, although they're primary state. And then the mobile sources were supposed to be federal. So remember, planning was the key word when all of these acts were written. We're big into planning. So states were going to write a state implementation plan for the Clean Air Act. So the state of California Air Resources Board receives delegated authority from the United States and from the state of California. It's got authority coming in 2 ways, and its job is to write a plan for how California will not emit more pollution of many different sorts, so that the total amount of pollution we emit will not be large enough to drive our air beyond the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That was a long-winded thing, right? So we have the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We have to write a set of regulations on firms that stop their pollution to the extent that we satisfy NAAQS. That's what a SIP is. So we don't have any choice about the goal. We've got to satisfy the standards. We have big choice about how we do it. So we can decide that we want to have no reactive organics because they're terrible for us. And we could essentially close down all factories that use spray paint. And we did. So if you want to produce this table, you can't do it in Los Angeles because it's a sprayed finish. And what we will make you do to keep that sprayed finish out of the air is so extreme that you'd be much better off going somewhere else and spraying the finish. So we drove that out. your dry cleaner. Our dry cleaning is expensive, not quite as expensive as it is here, which is the world record, but it's quite expensive. Why? Because this stuff cannot get in the air. And so you can't have a ma and pa dry cleaner factory. It can't be done. You've got to recapture all of the chemicals, or you've got to find a process that doesn't leave them in the air. So we can decide by industry what we want to do. We don't have to say everybody cuts back 5%. We can say, we like our refineries. They'll cut back 10%. We hate spray paint. We hate furniture finishing. And we hate dry cleaning. They're going to cut back 75%. We can do that, and we do. That's what a SIP is. It's taking the total amount of a pollutant that we want emitted and breaking it over the potential sources. And it gets made by looking at the list of ways to control pollution. So each and every, let me finish a little bit here and then I'll get on to that. So we make a SIP, we send it to the US EPA. If it meets the standards, it looks like it's going to actually make our air clean, they have no choice, they have to sign off on it. They certify it, then it becomes US law, not just state law. So what we do is we have a list of all things that pollute. You know, all big things that pollute. We don't care about small things. And for each thing, we have a list of ways you could clean it up. It's back to these technologies. And then what we do is basically we minimize the total cost of cleanup. So basically run a linear program that picks out the control techniques by control category so that we meet our emission standard for the state or for each airshed in the state, and we do so at minimum cost. We're not required to do that. We're not required to consider the cost, but we have a large air resources board and we do a good job of what we do. So that's how we actually do ours. And so we impose on each plant a discharge permit based on technology. So we use TBES, and each plant will have an emission standard for each criteria pollutant that was in that NAAQS list. Once upon a time, we did this in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Now that creates a horrible acronym. That's SQAQMUD. SQAQMUD ran out of things to do. The air was still dirty, and every source was cleaned up in every way we knew how to clean them up. At that point, they did something radical. They decided to run a cap and trade program in NOx, SOx, and reactive organics. And there was enough room in the law for them to do that, and that was a surprise to me. So they didn't say, we know how to clean it up, and therefore you have to clean it up. They said, overall, we have to meet NAAQS, and in order to meet NAAQS, each of you guys has to produce less. And so here are these permits. The permits add up to what we can afford to have emitted, and you guys go work it out. Some of you will close, some of you will find brilliant things to do, but that's up to you. We're done here. We don't know what to do. And then in the Northeast, they did the same thing later because their power plants also needed a trading scheme because there was no longer any way to just say, oh, you do with this, oh, you do with that. The law itself had always had some sort of trading schemes in them. They had imaginary bubbles. Be like, there are all these refineries on the coast in Los Angeles. So we draw an imaginary bubble around them, and we allow this much to come out with a TBES, and you guys can rearrange it inside the bubble any way you want. So there was precedent for this kind of stuff. There's a lot of empiricism about the Clean Air Act, and the place to start is Michael Greenstone's article, and the place to finish is a new article by Ryan Kellogg, which I think you could pick up as an NBER working paper and is forthcoming in the AER. And Ryan, by doing this carefully, finds that the Clean Air Act does have quite an effect. Okay, so we have the SIP idea. So that's one idea. But we have a second thing. We have New source performance standards. So you want to build a new factory, even in a compliant area, you have to use the best available control technology, a TBS-like idea, on that factory, even if the area is compliant. So no new stuff can get built without building it compliant. And that's in addition to the area having to be compliant. Even in pristine areas, you have to limit emissions. So there's no way to move jobs from a dirty area to a clean area. So that's not something you can do, because you go to do it in the clean area, then instead of the state implementation plan grabbing you, new source performance standards will grab you. So there's no way to build a new dirty thing. The political fight was, when was an old plant turned into a new plant? The law said it becomes a new plant when you make a physical modification to it, but not when you did maintenance. And so, of course, people rebuilt their plants and called it maintenance. And Bill Clinton finally called them on it, and a long series of lawsuits ensued, and eventually the United States won. And if you're interested in the economics of grandfathering, that is your diagram and your caption. What it says is the two types of firms. There's an expensive firm and a cheap firm. The cheap firm is the polluting firm. But all new firms will be the expensive firms. Grandfathering says the old firms get to keep working. As soon as the demand curve shifts out, see, demand curve shifts out, then when it shifts out, the long-run supply curve will be at the new higher level. And that means the old plants will make a rent to their non-compliance. And therefore, they will employ lawyers to protect, and politicians to protect their rent. And that's exactly what happened. And we're seeing the end of it now. So these firms were grandfathered in 1972, and they finally are being made to comply now, essentially. Coal is the place where you had the most of the grandfathering, because coal is basically dirty. There's an awful lot you have to do to clean it up. And there's a whole story in coal, which we won't tell. Bill Clinton is the one who made him clean it up. Bush tried to unclean it up, but the courts wouldn't let him, and so it got cleaned up. Hazardous substances are just they look like the new source performance standards, but just much more stringent. So if you want to emit some radiation, it's much more stringent how much you can emit. And there's a story there which we won't tell. Mobile sources were supposed to be regulated by the US EPA, but California was given the right to regulate mobile sources because the EPA standards that would work for the rest of the country would leave Southern California unlivable. So they created this special exception. And they wrote it so once we regulate cars, any other state can adopt our regulations. So we have two first movers, US EPA and Cal EPA. And if Cal EPA sets a tighter standard, then other states can and will go with our tighter standard. Basically, the Northeast and the Midwest buy into our tighter standards, which are the basis for the tightest of the European standards. The southern states like to breathe their pollution, and they go with the weaker standards. And so states have a choice there. The actual technicalities of the law is that California is said to get a waiver of federal preemption, but under the act they have to give us the waiver. And one bright day, we looked at the Clean Air Act and we said, the Clean Air Act actually says the words climate change. Clean Air Act was written in 1972, or at least the Clean Air Act amendments that we're talking about, written in 1972. So it provided for climate change. So we said, well, you know, we're used to regulating the criteria pollutants this way, but as we read the law, we can regulate greenhouse gases. And so we tried it. And we wrote rules for regulating greenhouse gases. Basically, we required that the fleet average greenhouse gas output be decreased by 25%, and I know it was like 15 years. That's where those 6-speed transmissions came in I told you about. And we took this all the way. Actually, we ended up having a court case over this in which the Automobile Manufacturers Association, it's Green Mountain versus Crombie. If you Google Green Mountain versus Crombie, you will find the actual decision, or I can send it to you. And they went to court to stop us from doing it, and they had all kinds of reasons, and they lost in all kinds of ways. And I got to spend a week of my life defending the air and the place of, and it's a beer story. We tried it in Vermont. But the net result was the federal courts went with us, and we can and we do regulate greenhouse gases independent of the United States, and we have many other states joining us. So, been to cars, we have grams of NOx per mile. We have mandatory zero pollution vehicles, part of our fleet. But we came into this problem again. We keep cleaning things up. We clean up all the things we're supposed to clean up, but the feds don't clean up the things they're supposed to clean up. So it got to the point where 40% of what's remainable to clean up in the South Coast was heavy trucks and trains, which we were never supposed to regulate. No one in their wildest dreams thought we would regulate that. And what we said is, we're not going to, if you don't allow us to regulate this, we won't write a state implementation plan. And you can take the political heat from closing down every factory in California. And eventually the feds gave in. There was nothing they could do. They had a choice. Either they had to write a plan that took it all out of point sources that were already the most heavily regulated on the planet, or they had to let us regulate trucks and diesel locomotives. And so they did. And so trucks in the United States are now becoming clean because California got the waiver of federal preemption, and we insisted that every single truck on the road capture its particulate matter. And newer trucks, we insist they don't produce it. And all trucks, we forced them into a low sulfur fuel, whether they like it or not. And so we grabbed the authority, and once we did that, every other state that you'd think of as a blue state, votes Democratic, follows us. And since truck manufacturers don't really want to produce two types of trucks, we will win, and all trucks in the United States will be cleaned up. We also go after boats, by the way. If you drive a boat, a ship, a container ship, into the port, in Southern California, very shortly you will have to turn its engines off and plug it in, because we will not let you run its motors in port. And we will also make you stop using dirty diesel fuel some number of miles out from our coast because it blows towards us. So we really will push this quite a bit. So we've shifted the center of environmental regulation away from Washington, which has the South, which doesn't want, and the North, which wants, to us, way in the West. And then we just have half the country follow us and all the industry. Role for economics. You don't have to ever mention the word economics or money when you do this. California does, but that's our choice. It's not forced on us. So we have very much interest in still having a state left after we regulate. We regulate strictly, and we carefully estimate cost, and we will back off if we can't. The last piece of this is acid rain. Acid rain was the first national trading program. It's the first example of cap and trade. And economists absolutely get to take the credit for forcing this, particularly Bob Stavins at Harvard spent a lot of his life in Washington on committees pushing the idea of tradable permits. Of course, Montgomery invented them 30 years earlier. And the answer is real simple. If you have a power plant, you get some number of tradable permits for SOx. And you can buy more, or you can sell them, or you can clean up. It's all up to you. There's a very long literature there. And the reason why is that the permits turned out to be very cheap. Everybody thought the permits would be expensive, and they landed up cheap. And there were a couple reasons. The first reason was people went to low sulfur coal. So they no longer had to remove 95% of the sulfur, they just had to meet a standard. The cheapest way to do that is to buy coal that doesn't have sulfur in it. So they used low sulfur coal. And that was a good part of cleaning up. The next set of articles recognized that the power plants were also subject to new source performance standards and state implementation plans. And so they were being forced to clean up by other pieces of the Clean Air Act. So the value of the permits is a lot less, because if you already have to clean up, then you clean up and the demand for permits goes down. And that's an important piece of how the thing works. The permits are there, it's true, but they're not the big deal. The big deal is the command and control regulation. And then the permits are the icing on the cake. Now, if you come back when you're my age, I bet you it'll be the other way. I bet you the tradable permits will be the big deal. And the command and control will have just been left where it is. And so every time we need to screw things down more, the permits go up in price. You have to wait a while to see that. Is this fun? No. If you're in Los Angeles and you build a plant, let's say you want to redo your oil refinery. There's a lot of oil refineries, 50,000 people employed. It's not a small thing. Well, you're in the reclaim program, so you need permits under reclaim. You're subject to the new source performance standards, so you have TBS from them as well. You have hazardous air pollutants. And you have acid rain trading. You got 4 different programs regulating your air. And you'll have to comply with all 4. And that's just, the states and feds. The locals can do whatever they want to you on top of that. And that's your air. You also have water. One of my students said I have to say something about demand side measures for energy and hence pollution. It's actually a big deal to us. We subsidize insulation, efficient appliances and things of that sort. And we do it because the marginal cost of power is much larger than the average cost of power, and the regulated prices of power were regulated at price equals average cost. That's not as true as it used to be, but that's what drove our thinking. And so we subsidize buying things like those windows. Now, water looks to be the same as air, the Clean Water Act, not Section 404, but the part that's supposed to deal with emissions, except it's not. The issue here again was, how do the states and the feds interact? Water was always a state thing. They were regulating water. All the states were regulating water for a long time. So when we started to modernize our pollution law, we had to deal with the fact there were pre-existing interests. And the law ends up being fatally weak because of that. In theory, it looks great. It looks like Sweden's law with a goal of no discharge. You can't have no discharge to water. It just can't be done. Next, that's ridiculous. And of course, it doesn't happen. So what did they actually do? They did 3 things. One is they did a direct subsidy of sewage treatment. That was the most spectacularly effective thing anyone ever did. The second is they have national permit, I can't get MDES right. It's the discharge permitting system, and I'm missing the acronym for the moment. And the third is they went backwards. They made states set standards for little pieces of water and then work backwards and put in TBES to enforce their standards. So those are the three things. Sewage, we just paid 90%, federal government paid 90% of the price of a sewage treatment plant. So where my brother and I grew up on Little Neck Bay, there was a sewage treatment plant that just dumped stuff in the water, and if you set foot in the bay, basically you had to be taken to the doctor and boiled because God knows what was in it. It was raw sewage. And then they took money from the United States and they built a sewage treatment plant, and you can swim in that bay today. No one has the nerve to eat shellfish from the bay, but there's so many mussels there you could not count them. There's no chance you could harvest them all. So the ecosystem has completely come back from building the sewage treatment plants. And that would be basically the story in New York. If that program had continued, New York would have cleaned up the remaining of its sewage treatment, and you'd be able to swim everywhere in New York City waters. It'd be like walking into the harbor here and being able to swim in the middle of New York. Conservatives hated it because it's a cost money thing. They hate anything that costs money. Liberals hated it because they said, if you're going to build them sewage treatment plants, then they're going to have sprawl. Instead of building in cities, which is good, where the sewage treatment plants are, they'll go and build out in the suburbs because you're paying some of the costs. And so both sides said, great, so let's not do it. The result is the water got dirtier. You'd have the same problem up here, by the way, in the Baltic. If the European Union wants to do something good about water, it's simple. Go build the sewage treatment plants. I mean, if you look at the studies, they tell you that's essentially what you should do. So why don't you stop studying it and take some of this money that you waste and go build sewage treatment plants. The second is discharge permits. So you build a plant, you got to go to the US EPA and get a discharge permit. The only problem with that is that the discharge permits were set based upon maximum plant capacity. So all you had to do is lie about your plant capacity, plus most plants are not run all the way at capacity, and you'd have enough permits. So a long time later, a bunch of economists discovered there were more permits than anyone needed, and that's why it was ineffective. So basically they have to change that if they're going to make it work. The third idea is that for each piece of water, a state has to decide what it's going to be used for. It has to be at least good enough so that you can fish it and you can boat in it. So you get the water on you, it can't be a hazard. But it doesn't have to be good enough to be swimmable, and it doesn't have to be good enough to be drinkable. But a state could decide to make it swimmable or drinkable. So they basically have three choices: boatable, swimmable, drinkable. Once they choose one of those choices, then they have to figure out how much crap can you put in the water and still have it meet the standards. And then they have to issue permits to everybody around the waterway in sufficient quantities so it meets the standards. So if a state says, this stream over here, we'll make it the least stringent. We'll make it boatable. The instant they do that, the rest of the regulations falls on their head, and they actually will have to go to the industrial plants and everybody else and say, you guys got to clean up. But if they do this, water, there's no water here. Stream, I don't see any streams. I'm not going to regulate that stream. No, it's hard. I don't want to do that yet. If they do that, they can put off regulating it apparently for over 50 years. And so that part of the Clean Water Act is not very stringent either. The state of Montana actually pollutes the Missouri River enough so that it's not drinkable. And they do that with nitrogen. And given that they're growing wheat and you don't use nitrogen for wheat to speak of, it's a real trick. And you haven't have any idea what Montana is? It's like, how many people? Under 1 million people and bigger than Sweden? You know, some number of Swedens with less than 1 million people. All right, that get an idea? And they've managed to pollute a giant river to the point where you cannot purify it. And they did it without an industrial plant. They did it with cattle. Right? So that's how non-binding, and then everybody else in the United States, in the middle of the United States, is below them on that river. So it's already polluted by the time it leaves the source. So that's how non-binding the Clean Water Act is. And the reason why is there's no ability for the feds to say, oh, if you don't set the standard, we'll set it for you. That's what's forcing about the Clean Air Act. If you don't do your part under the Clean Air Act, Mr. Alabama, the US EPA will do it for you. We can do it for you, it's okay. And that doesn't exist in the Clean Water Act. And so states that want to run dirty could just run dirty. And everyone downstream from them, well, that's a problem. Now it's beginning to be forced. Come back in 40 years, I think it'll be effective. Non-point water solution. There's another whole piece about agriculture being exempt. And of course, agriculture is a major nitrogen source. And so eventually that has to go away too. And the comment on this is really that ag and mining interests are predominant in these rural places, and clean water is the last words that they want to hear ever. And so we don't get it. So we have 10 more minutes. Do you want me to go through a collection of other laws, or do you want to ask questions? What's your choice? Should I mumble on, or do you want to discuss any of this? I mean, you've gotten the key things. That's what comes next to secretaries. Yeah, because it was, when it was originally set up, it was very logical. I mean, the California Clean Air Act it was very logically set up by a group of people who cared. And they started off with public health, and the US copied ours. So it starts off with public health. So first we figure out what the public health is. Then we figure out how to do it. We're engineers. Okay? So we figure out how to do it. And then we make them do it. That's how it was thought of. So nobody in 1968, if you'd said to them tradable permits, you would have been David Montgomery, and you would have gotten, a prize for your article of enduring worth. The article wasn't even written yet, because no one had thought of that. And if you'd read Coase, you might have thought of it. But nobody thought that Coase was about the environment. So that's how it got built in. And then the agency filled itself up with engineers. Now imagine going to an agency full of engineers and saying, actually we don't need any of you guys. We just set the price and they do it. Why don't you just go home? and so, it goes on its way. But they're also effective. And that's hard to argue with. People in California can go out, their kids can go outside and play. So they're not anxious to try out your newfangled idea. Well, California, California, on this issue, we're Sweden, okay? We're going to save the planet from you other guys, whether you like it or not. We're certainly going to save it for ourselves. And our Republican governor, Mr. Terminator, was highly pro-environment and put his arm around Fran Pavley, a lefty commie legislator, and the Terminator and Fran wrote greenhouse gas regulations together, and they got passed by everybody, because when you stand up and you say, I'm in favor of global warming, you just lost your state Senate seat. You're gone. There's nowhere in the state that will elect you. So we're a strong environment state. Why? Because we were Beijing. You couldn't breathe. People remember that. So that's what drives our politics. It wasn't it's not theoretical to the Californians. It's very real. Anybody else have anything? Okay, I've given you your chance. I'm going to talk about one more. I won't talk about that one. I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm not going to talk about that one. I want to talk about this one, because it got all the press. So what you used to do with toxic waste, if you were a manufacturer, is you used to take it and put it in a barrel and bury it. Because really, there wasn't anything to do with it. No one had yet realized you could take the stuff and put it in a cement kiln, which is what you now do with it. So all over the world, there are buried barrels of junk, very toxic junk. And these barrels float. They are lighter than soil. So even though you may bury them down 25 or 30 feet, over time, they will come to the surface like zombies to get you. And one bright day at Love Canal in New York, which was a failed canal. Someone was digging an industrial age canal and it didn't make any sense, and so they abandoned it. And so the Hooker Chemical Company said, what a great place, and it put its barrels at the bottom and then filled in the canal. And then a long time went by, and the local school district said to Hooker, we want this canal from you to build an elementary school. And Hooker said, we buried toxic chemicals here. You're out of your tree. There's no way we're going to give this to you. You know, it's bad enough we own it. And the school district said, no, no, no. We're going to take it by eminent domain, or you can give it to us. And Hooker said, you're out of your tree. And eventually, they realized they'd have to give it to him. So they decided to write a contract that said, for $1, it's yours. And you understand that there are dangerous toxic chemicals that are going to come to the surface and kill your school kids. That's roughly what the contract said. And the education department signed off and built their elementary school on top of it. And, of course, the chemicals came to the surface and they killed off the entire neighborhood. People's plants in their backyard started dying. The place was a toxic wreck, exactly as predicted, and now it had a school on top of it. Well, that galvanized national attention and caused the most draconian act ever written to be written, which is what we call Superfund. Superfund was money raised from chemical companies by a tax. And that money would be used to clean up. If that's what it was, it would be fine. But that's not what it was. That was only the beginning. The way it works is, if you as a citizen discover something that is leaking toxics to the environment, not that you put them there, just that it's leaking them now, in the present, you are obligated to report that to the US EPA. If you do not, it's criminal. So once you report it, the EPA will identify potentially responsible parties. So for instance, the current landowner. So imagine you bought a piece of forest property and you didn't realize there'd been an old mill there. And wherever there's a mill, I guarantee you there are toxics. And now, my God, the trees are beginning to die around this pit. And you report it to the EPA. Guess what? You didn't bury it. You own the land. While you own the land, it's leaking to the environment. You're a potentially responsible party. You're the person who owned it before. You're potentially responsible. Basically, anyone who touched it, not just the person who buried it, but everyone who owned it all along the chain is a potentially responsible party. Really wide net. The EPA gives them a choice. You clean it up, or we'll clean it up right now. And if the EPA cleans it up, then it goes after you for what it cost. So if you're a real company and you have a toxic waste site, you'll clean it up yourself. It'll be way cheaper. The reason why it's such a problem is there's a lot of toxic waste sites that don't currently have real companies attached. And those, there's no way to get the money for. And that's where Superfund falls down. There's not nearly enough money in the Superfund to pay for all of the toxic waste that doesn't have responsible parties. The reason why the act is draconian is that people who had very little to do with it could have all of the liability. So let's say I buried it and I don't have 2 pennies to my name. You bought it from me, and you're rich. You're General Motors or some real company. You sold it to her, and she discovers it, and she doesn't have much money. We could get it all out of you, because joint and several liability. So we don't even have to waste the time trying to get money out of a stone. We can make the person with the biggest pockets pay it all. That's why the act is draconian. So it doesn't have anything to do with what you contributed, it just has to do with you touched it. You touched it, you could be as much as 100% responsible. A local example where Sweden decided to be reasonable is there are PCBs from an old forest establishment on the bottom of the Umeå River, the Umeå Elf, and it would cost about $100 million to take them out. Under American law, they'd come out. Under Swedish law, they realized they'd be a lot cheaper and probably safer to leave them where they are. Under American law, the people who own the area now, which is now a giant shopping center, probably be made to pay for it. Yeah. So CERCLA is not fun. On the other hand, if you like to see people like Exxon taken to the cleaners, it's the ultimate act for that. Right? The cleanup of the Exxon Valdez is forced by CERCLA. They have to pay every penny for it, and they have to pay for the damage to the fishery, that is natural resource damages, and they have to pay whatever existence value we can pin on them for the locals as well. So really have very broad damages. And that is the most, if you do valuation, that's the most famous case there ever was, because it pits Peter Diamond, who knows nothing about this, Dan McFadden, who should have known more about this, and everyone else you've ever heard of in the profession against Richard Carson and Michael Hahnemann and some of my friends, and Michael and Richard won, and Exxon paid. And I think that's probably the right place to leave you.